All right, here we are again, and we are continuing on with the Middle Ages. So, tiny bit of review. We learned that Gregorian chant was extremely important throughout the Middle Ages, but I want you to know that there was also music outside of the church. So, what do we call religious music? And when we study music, we call it sacred. And sacred music was incredibly important throughout the Middle Ages. So let's see if we remember the two main types of church services we talked about in the last lesson. Those would be the Mass and the offices, right? Sacred music. So what about music that is outside of the church? So what do we call music that is not religious, right? We call that secular music. And there was definitely a lot of secular music in the Middle Ages, but not a whole lot was written down. And that is because people generally couldn't read or write like the clergy could, the monks and the nuns. So the majority of notated music from the Middle Ages came from the church because that's where all the musical scholars were. So we do know that there was secular music because of secondary resources. So let's back up. What is a secondary resource in music history? This is something written about the music or images or artwork depicting musicians or people making music or dancing, right? It's not the actual music itself. So a primary resource in music history is the sheet music. Secondary resource is somebody saying in their journal that they went to the village dance and there was music and there was a piper playing, right? So the first large collection of secular, non-religious songs that survived were composed during the 12th and 13th centuries. So let's think back a minute. What part of the Middle Ages is this? It's the High Middle Ages, right? So if we review our timeline, the overall dates of the Middle Ages, 450 to 1450, and we have early, high, and late Middle Ages. We touched on the early Middle Ages in the last class. Now we're going to look at some of the most important secular music written in the High Middle Ages. And the group of musicians that composed them were French nobles, all right? And if you remember from your reading, they were either called troubadours or trouvères. So if they were from southern France, they were called troubadours. And if they were from northern France, they were called trouvères. And my goodness, I could never keep those straight when I was in music history class. Never. So the troubadours, trouvères were generally the higher class, traveling poet or musician, and they usually wrote something called a chanson, which sounds very fancy, and it just means song in French. And the music that we have that has survived is just the melody and the words, all right? So let's take a look at a piece, and this is manuscript music from a woman troubadour, the Countess Beatrice de Dia, right? And if we think about what we learned about Gregorian chant written in the middle of, written in the notation of the Middle Ages, again, no sharps or flats, no rhythmic notation, right? And in Gregorian chant, there was a narrow melodic range, a lot of melismatic music, sounding very heavenly to our ears. And there was no indication for dynamics, no indication to sing forte or piano, right? So if you look at this music, we see that we're in a very similar style of music notation, looks similar to Gregorian chant. So let's again be thankful that somebody's put this into modern music notation. And what we can see is that, again, it's just all like eighth notes. There's no rhythmic notation. But it was likely performed in a rhythm that was passed down through what we call oral tradition, which just means I taught it to you. I was like, hey, let me teach you this song. Here's how it goes. row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, right? We just pass it down through oral tradition, and it probably had a regular meter with a clearly defined beat. We just don't know what that was. There are no sharps or flats as before, and it is not in a major or a minor key, it's in a mode, okay? So composers like this countess would actually base a composition on a Gregorian chant melody, which just seems kind of weird to me, but hey, whatever. Again, there are no dynamics, so we're not there yet. Now, the form of this song is what we call strophic. All that means is that every verse has the same tune. So a verse is called a strophe, right? And researchers of music from the Middle Ages will use their studies of secondary sources to sort of fill in the blanks. And you'll find a lot of different versions of these chansons that have been performed, fairly recently, and there are recordings on the internet. And so you can go and look for some, and you'll just be like, wow, these are really different. So we're going to listen to a couple of different interpretations of this song so you can see how differently they can be performed. And here's the translation so that you can see what the words are being sung, because obviously it's not in English. So let's listen to the first one. And I want you to hear, in this one, there's sort of a droning string instrument that goes along with it, and the instrument actually gets its own verse. So they did this because they know they were instruments because of secondary sources, even though there's no actual music written for the instrument. So let's listen to that. Okay, so definitely sounds like something you wouldn't just listen to on the radio. It's different, but pretty. So let's listen to a different version, and you'll hear another droning instrument and kind of a nice sort of a flute instrument. And I want you to also notice in both of these that there's a lot of freedom in how they do their vocal effects. Like they choose to do some different effects. And again, these are performers who have studied secondary sources, so they kind of know what's going on there. Also, not melismatic. We're not singing a ton of notes for like one syllable. So let's listen to this. right, so which one did you like better? very different interpretations of the same song. So again, we don't have any primary resources or primary sources, so we have to rely on study of secondary sources. So, okay, we're going to shift gears now. We covered musical texture a little while ago, and we learned to listen to whether we have a melody, just the melody, monophonic, or if it was a melody with harmony, homophonic, or several melodies interweaving at once, polyphonic. And that was kind of a struggle for us to hear the difference. Well, to make things worse, early polyphony, which is what we call polyphonic music, really sounds like what we've learned to call homophonic. You're like, wait, what? So let's talk about the development of polyphony in the Middle Ages. And it has a special name, organum, right? And it began 700 to 900 AD. So we're now jumping back in time a little bit to the early Middle Ages. So I taught you polyphony, polyphonic, homophonic, monophonic, musical texture. These are all things that you will not really know unless you've studied music. Now we're going to get even deeper, and we're going to be like, organum is early polyphony. What? So let's look at some organum examples and just see how music has progressed. So first we have something called simple organum, right? And if you look at it, you can see that we've added another melodic line, so basically singing in harmony, and that we also have the same amount of space between the notes. So they're in parallel motion as they move. We're going to learn about intervals later, the space between the two notes, but for now it's okay to remember that simple organum is sung in strict parallel motion, okay? It could be it could be a fourth or a fifth or an octave, but strict parallel motion. So let's listen to this. It's very short. Right? Very simple, but it's definitely a different experience than listening to Gregorian chant where everyone is singing the same note. And so possibly they think that it started with singing octaves. Like, okay, well, we've got changed and unchanged voices, right? So that is boys whose voices haven't changed would be unchanged voices, and then men changed voices. So that's maybe how it started. And then at some point, maybe somebody sang the wrong note instead of a pure octave, and they were just like, wait, that's not the right note, but it sounds really cool. Let's try that. And then all of a sudden you have this simple organum. All right. So time goes on, organum continues to develop, and now we get into something called composite organum. So what we see here, the treble clef is singing the same thing as the bass clef, so it looks more complicated than it is. Basically, we've taken simple organum and we've doubled it, right? Treble parts, bass parts. So you might imagine a choir with sopranos and altos, tenors and basses. The sopranos and the tenors are singing the same notes, and then the altos and the basses are singing the same notes, a couple of octaves apart. They are still in strict parallel motion. So let's listen to that. Okay, we are not quite a four-part harmony yet, but we are definitely getting there. So this is still considered early polyphony. All right, hold on to your hats because it keeps on developing. Let's look at something we call modified parallel organum. So take a look at that. What makes it modified is that it expands outward from a single note until it gets into parallel motion for a minute, and then it comes back in. So we are no longer in strict parallel motion. So let's listen to it. So it still sounds like harmony to us. We're like, wait, this is not polyphony. It is considered early polyphony. So we're not done yet. Let's get to where it gets really interesting and look at something called free organum. Oh my goodness. All right, so what's going on here? A whole lot. They are moving in and out of unisons and octaves, and all sorts of intervals are happening, right? Crazy town. What else do you see in here? Oh, that's a B flat. Hey, it's our first accidental. Yay! So this is much later on, in the high Middle Ages. So they developed rules for what kind of distance you could have between the two notes and when certain things could happen. So we're going to learn more about intervals later, but for right now it's important just to note that this is truly where the beginning of modern music notation and sound happens. Okay? So for the quiz, you need to remember that this is early polyphony. This is not melody and harmony, which is what our modern ears are telling us, right? These are considered to be interweaving melodies. They were not yet thinking in terms of harmony. Harmony was a byproduct of two melodies sounding together. So you will need to identify these on the listening test, all right? Okay, now, what is still missing from our music notation? It's the rhythm. Rhythmic notation is missing. So remember what we said about the Troubadours and the Troubadours. We know that there was likely a regular meter with a clearly defined beat. And eventually the Middle Ages composers decided it was time to figure out a way to write this stuff down. So from about 1170 to 1200 AD, there were two choir masters at Notre Dame Cathedral, and they developed early versions of rhythmic notation. It's not what we've been studying, like compound division of the beat, simple division of the beat. Not yet, but it was a start. So these two choir masters, and you can think of them as like the worship pastor or the music minister, they were named Léonin and Periton. And they used something called measured rhythm. It had definite time values and clearly defined rhythm. This is the first time in history that music notation showed precise rhythms and pitches. Now, at first, the new notation just showed rhythmic patterns, and the beat had to be subdivided into three. What do we call that? Compound division of the beat. And they felt they needed to divide it into three very simply because of the Holy Trinity, right? These are choir masters in a church, and they were honoring God by dividing the beat into three. So the rhythmic patterns were called modes, and they showed a pattern of long and short, and they were paired up with forms of poetry. So you basically knew what rhythm to sing based on what form of poetry you were singing. So if we take a look here, we've got some different rhythmic modes, right? And if we look at the modern notation of these modes, we can see that long and short aren't always the exact same length, which can be confusing. So the third mode might be better described as long, short, medium, or long, shorter, short. So now we've got rhythmic modes, and we've got like pitch modes. Well, so many things to think about. So let's go back to these two composers. Léonin came first, and then Periton came along, and he was the first one to write organum for three voices, which is organum triplum, right? Triple. So if we take a look at this music, we see three voices. The top two are written in rhythmic modes, which looks like a modification of the third one. The bottom voice is long held notes. It's like a drone. And that bottom voice is called the cantus firmus, or fixed melody, right? Cantus is just melody. Firmus is firm, so fixed melody. And this is basically a chant melody stretched out really long. Now, we are still in a narrow range for the singers. They're never more than an octave apart, And we're still seeing our friend, the B flat. So let's watch, and I want you to listen for a few things. I want you to listen to how the harmony sounds. Let's see what you think. Okay, so number one, that's a little difficult to perform. Wow, that's a difficult piece. Number two, the harmonies to our ears sound hollow because we're not yet building chords in what we think of as a traditional way. So it sounds a little bit hollow in harmony. But to our ears also, as we've learned about polyphony, now this sounds like polyphony, right? So from around 1200 AD, composers were writing true polyphonic music in 3 and 4 voice parts, right? So we have early polyphony, organum, right? Simple organum, composite organum. But it feels like it's homophonic to our ears. When we get into 1200 AD and on, the composers are starting to write true polyphony because they've got now the freedom to write in rhythmic notation. All right? Whew, that's a lot to cover, but we've got a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit about instrumental music from the Middle Ages. Very little has survived, but we know that it has survived, again, because of secondary sources. We know that there was a lively tradition of instrumental music. So what's important to remember that vocal music was more important in the Middle Ages, but there was instrumental music. So we're going to wrap up by listening to a piece called Estampi, which is a dance. So let's listen to that. So as we listen, we can imagine what some of those instruments are now that we know a little bit about them, right? Maybe there's a recorder or some kind of a wooden flute or a shawm or a drum or a lute, right? Now we still hear that these are written in modes. This is not major and minor, not yet. It's definitely a nice complicated rhythm, and the lute is playing sort of a drone underneath. So that's kind of a neat, you can imagine sort of a lively village dance with this music. All right, so we're going to stop there, and I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.